Welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to understand about what all EKS IAM use cases we are going to implement in next 6 sections. If you see here, we are going to use AWS IAM user, IAM group, IAM role and IAM policy from AWS perspective. And from Kubernetes perspective, we are going to use Kubernetes config map, role binding, a role, cluster role binding and cluster role. So let's understand and what all use cases we are going to implement and also see those use cases in a high level. So let's see here. As part of section 19, we are going to provision AWS IAM admins as EKS admins, which means a user with full access in AWS cloud, that respective user you are going to provision as EKS admin in EKS cluster with full access to that EKS cluster. And then you will also explore another use case where a user with no access in AWS, which means he doesn't have any access other than logging into AWS management console. So that type of user also you will go ahead and then provision as EKS admin. At that point, that user gets the access to even the EKS Kubernetes management console in AWS too, in addition to admin access using kubectl. So both use cases, first we will implement manually and then we'll go ahead and then automate it in section 21. So this is one way. And the other thing is, if you have 100 admin users or 100 basic users, if you want to provision to EKS clusters, so that's not feasible with these approaches. So at that point, you need to use another concept available for us in AWS and EKS in combination, which is provision EKS admins with AWS IAM roles and IAM groups. So we will use that concept and we will implement this scenario. And once we manually implement and understand in detail, we will automate that using section 22 with Terraform. After that, here you have implemented EKS admins. In section 24, you will provision EKS read-only users with IAM roles and IAM groups. And you'll also use additional concepts like Kubernetes cluster role and cluster role binding in section 24. And finally, in section 25, right, you will have a use case where a developer requesting full access to a namespace dev in EKS cluster, and in addition also that respective developer is asking for read-only access to the entire EKS cluster. At that point, you will implement the Kubernetes role binding for specific access to that namespace for the developer, and also you will implement Kubernetes cluster role and cluster role binding for entire read-only access for the developer, and you will implement that in combination with IAM roles and IAM groups concept. So these are the things we are going to implement as part of this EKS IAM demos. If you want to see them in detail, this is a simple admin user, AWS IAM admin user provision to EKS as admin. So how it is going to happen, and whenever you provision that user, what happens whenever that respective user runs the command kubectl get pods, what happens? The entire flow is documented and explained in that respective demo. In addition to that, you can see here, whenever you provide your EKS admin user, right? So that user related changes, whatever you need to do in AWS auth config map of your EKS cluster also is very clearly explained. So this is for your EKS admin, IAM admins provisioned as EKS admins. So that respective users ARN, IAM user ARN is updated in map user section of your AWS auth config map in EKS cluster. And when you want to provision the basic user, for that basic user, you need to provide the EKS full access IAM policy. So for that user, he need to have the access to the EKS related, even the AWS console management dashboard, right? So for that purpose, we'll give a EKS full access IAM policy associated for that user. And in addition to that, that user also will get updated in AWS auth config map. So once he is updated in AWS auth config map and he has the system masters group in AWS auth config map in EKS cluster. So he becomes the admin in EKS cluster, and he is a basic user in AWS cloud, but he gets full access in EKS cluster. So this both use cases, admin and basic, both we will automate it with Terraform. And later we'll find out that having this single user, right, whatever you are adding in map user section, if you want to add 100 users and provision the access, it becomes a complex things to manage this AWS auth config map in EKS cluster. So at that point, what all options we have, we will explore, and we will implement this IAM roles and IAM groups in combination with AWS EKS cluster, AWS auth config map. So there you are going to create a STS assume role policy and EKS full access policy and associate it to IAM role. And this IAM role you will reference in the IAM group policy, and you will associate that IAM group policy to IAM group EKS admins. And now you can create any number of IAM users in your AWS cloud and just associate them to this EKS admins group, and that all these users directly gets access to EKS cluster. How? This IAM role will also be updated in AWS auth config map in map roles section. Here you will update that IAM role. So now what happens is, any number of users, just create the user in AWS and associate him to IAM group. He becomes the admin for your EKS cluster. In the same way, how we are provisioning EKS admins by associating them to IAM groups and using the IAM role in our map roles section with group as system masters with EKS, making them EKS admins in EKS cluster, we can also do the same thing for EKS read-only users using IAM roles and IAM groups. So in this case, you are going to give IAM policy here as EKS read-only access, and you will create a group with EKS read-only, and you will be able to create the users here. Only change is, in this IAM policy, you put the EKS read-only access policy with the specific permissions which are required for only read-only access to the EKS cluster. And in addition to that, in AWS auth config map also, instead of system masters group, you will create a custom group name EKS read-only group. So earlier when you have implemented the IAM roles with IAM groups, you have given the group as system masters, which means those users get full access to EKS cluster. Here you will give the group name as EKS read-only group. And how this read-only group gets the accesses required in our EKS cluster is using the Kubernetes RBAC concepts, which are cluster role and then cluster role binding. So in Kubernetes cluster role, you will define the EKS read-only cluster role, stating that for these API groups, for core APIs, for the resources, nodes, namespaces, pods, events, and services, provide the verbs get and list. Only provide these two permissions for these services. And for apps, API groups apps, which are nothing but resources, deployments, daemon sets, stateful sets, and replica sets, provide the verbs get and list permission. Same for API group batch and resources jobs. So this is cluster, Kubernetes cluster role. And we'll have something called cluster role binding, wherein we will tie the cluster role and also the subject. Subject can be a group, user, or a service account. So in our case, it is going to be a group. So we'll see what exactly it is. So we'll define a cluster role binding. First, we will get the role reference, which is whatever the role we have created here, Kubernetes cluster role v1 dot EKS read-only cluster role dot metadata of name of 0. So this is the role reference, this part. And next is subject. So you will tie the subject and the role reference using cluster role binding, and subject becomes whatever you have defined in AWS auth config map in the group section for EKS read-only role, whatever the group name you have defined. I have defined a group name here as EKS read-only group. So if you provide the same name here, which means whatever the permissions you have defined inside this cluster role will be applicable for the users who is accessing from IAM with this assumed role. So from AWS IAM user, whatever you have created, EKS read 1 or EKS read 2, that user will assume this role, HR dev EKS read only role, and access your EKS cluster. And once he gets into the EKS cluster, inside that role based access control kicks in. And for that role based access control, that user uses the EKS read only group, and this EKS read only group is referenced in Kubernetes cluster role binding here, and this Kubernetes cluster role binding is having the role reference to this EKS read only cluster role, which means the EKS read 1 user will get these permissions on your EKS cluster. So these are the things we are going to discuss in detail when we are implementing also. And there will be one more use case where a developer requesting full access to a namespace dev in EKS cluster, and in addition he is also asking for read-only access to EKS cluster. We already know for read-only accessing the EKS cluster, we can implement the Kubernetes cluster role and cluster role binding and implement all those things which we have seen in previous section of the demo, right? So now the same thing you will apply here, but for giving the full access to a namespace, you need to create the Kubernetes role and role binding for that namespace and associate them. So if you see here, this is the EKS developer group you are going to create, and for this both cluster role and cluster role binding and role binding, right? In both these things, in cluster role binding and in role binding, you are going to use this group EKS developer group, so that the users who is assuming the role HR dev EKS developer role will have the read-only access to EKS cluster using this cluster role, and that user also gets the full access to this dev namespace using this role. So these are the things we are going to implement practically. And once we complete all these AWS IAM use cases with AWS EKS, our AWS auth config map is going to look this way. As part of section 19, 20, 21, in the map user section, right, you have provisioned a basic EKS admin user and also a AWS IAM admin with EKS admin user. So two users you have provisioned. One is IAM basic user and another one is IAM admin user. But both are admins inside EKS cluster, right? Because you have provided the group system masters for both users. So after this, we moved on to the next thing, which is HR dev EKS admin role, provisioning the admin users using the IAM groups. So that we have implemented. After that, provisioning IAM users using IAM groups with read-only access to EKS cluster as part of section 24 we implemented. And finally, we implemented provisioning IAM users who are developer users who need specific full access to a namespace and also a read-only access to EKS cluster, that we have implemented as part of section 25. These all things we are going to implement in a step-by-step approach in all these sections. So I'll see you in the next lecture. Until then, bye-bye. Thank you.